A heavy wooden door slams shut. On one side stands a family of legitimate sons, secure in their inheritance, protecting their wealth, because a promise to Yahweh could never be broken. But that reading overlooks a glaring contradiction hidden in the text. He takes the transactional politics of his trauma and aims them directly at the heavens. God did not ask for a vow. God did not require a bargain. The true tragedy of Jephthah is not that he was bound by a righteous promise, but that his deep-seated insecurity demanded a contract that God never requested. Standing on the edge of the battlefield, the warlord opens his mouth to negotiate with his creator. He offers a terrible price to guarantee his victory. But what exactly did Jephthah promise? And what did he expect to happen? The words leave his lips, sealing a fate he never intended. The words Jephthah speaks on the edge of the battlefield have sparked centuries of intense theological debate. He looks toward the heavens and makes his fatal offer. If you will give the Ammonites into my hand, then whatever comes out from the doors of my house to meet me when I return in peace from the Ammonites shall be the Lord's, and I will offer it up for a burnt offering. To understand the magnitude of this mistake, we have to look closely at the cultural and linguistic world of the ancient Near East. The Hebrew phrasing is deliberate, Hayotze Asher Yetze, which translates roughly to the completely coming out one, which comes out. If you read the 11th chapter of Judges carefully, you will find a detail that changes the entire meaning of the tragedy. What did Jephthah actually expect to walk out of his front door? Some commentators argue he always intended to sacrifice a human being, knowing his household servants or family would greet him. But the domestic architecture of an Iron Age Israelite home suggests something different. In this era, typical dwellings in the Levant were constructed with a courtyard or a pillared ground floor where valuable domestic animals, sheep, goats, and calves were sheltered to protect them from predators and theft. It was entirely normal for an animal to wander out of the doors of a rural estate. Jephthah likely envisioned a prized animal emerging first, which he would then offer as a lavish, spontaneous sacrifice to secure his military success. But even if he intended an animal, his vow exposes a deeply corrupted theology. Jephthah is overlaying Canaanite religion directly onto the God of Israel. In the pagan cultures surrounding Gilead, deities like Chemosh and Baal were viewed as distant, unpredictable, and inherently transactional. They did not love their worshippers. They had to be manipulated. If a Canaanite king wanted to guarantee a victory, he had to offer a bribe spectacular enough to force the god's hand. The more desperate the situation, the higher the price. Jephthah has spent his life in the wilderness, surrounded by these pagan ideologies, just verses before Jephthah opens his mouth to make his fatal bargain. The text states explicitly, "Then the Spirit of the Lord came upon Jephthah." He does not know the character of Yahweh. He does not understand a God who rescues out of covenant faithfulness and unmerited grace. So he treats the God of Israel like a local Canaanite deity. He treats him like a mercenary who demands a down payment. Jephthah believes his status is so fragile that he must invent a legally binding contract, a dramatic, unspecified burnt offering, known in Hebrew as an olah, to ensure God keeps his end of the bargain. He has engineered a Canaanite bribe to secure an Israelite victory. The tragic irony is that God grants the victory, but not because of the vow. The Spirit was already upon him before the vow was ever spoken. The text briefly and brutally details the aftermath of the conflict. Jephthah crosses into Ammonite territory and strikes them, from Aroer to Minnith. He captures 20 cities. The biblical historian describes it as a very great blow. The Ammonites are utterly subdued. The threat is eliminated. The outcast has achieved everything he ever wanted. He has saved his homeland, validated his leadership, and proven his worth to the men who once drove him into exile. The slaughter on the battlefield finally ends. The dust settles over the 20 ruined cities. The victorious warlord turns his army around and marches back toward Mizpah in absolute triumph. He was already empowered. He already had the divine backing he needed. The victory was already secured. He has won the war. But as he approaches the familiar doorway of his own home, The horrific cost of his Canaanite bargain is about to be demanded. The road to Mizpah is lined with the dust of a conquering army. Jephthah has won. The exiled son of a prostitute is returning as the undisputed, permanent ruler of Gilead. As he approaches his estate, he watches the door of his house, the very threshold he had weaponized in his desperate negotiation with God. The heavy wooden door swings open. It is not a calf. It is not a sheep wandering out from the courtyard. The first sound he hears is the rhythmic striking of tambourines. The first sight is his daughter, leading a procession of joy, dancing to celebrate her father's triumphant return. Before recording Jephthah's reaction, the biblical writer pauses the narrative to insert a devastating, heartbreaking detail. She was his only child. Besides her, he had neither son nor daughter. In the ancient Near East, an only child is not just a beloved family member. She is the sole carrier of his name, his bloodline, and his inheritance. Everything Jephthah fought for the permanent status. The return to his homeland. The dynasty he secured from the elders is entirely bound up in the life of the girl dancing in front of him. Yet he paused, looked to the heavens, and negotiated for a guarantee he already possessed. The central question is not whether Jephthah should have kept his vow, and he has just promised her to the fire. Watch his physical reaction. He does not fall to his knees in repentance. He does not beg God for mercy or offer his own life in exchange, the way Moses or David would. Instead, he grabs his garments and violently tears them apart. Then he opens his mouth, and the profound brokenness of his character is fully exposed. He says, "Alas, my daughter, you have brought me very low, and you have become the cause of great trouble to me, for I have opened my mouth to the Lord, and I cannot take back my vow." Listen to the chilling selfishness of those words. He does not say, "I have ruined everything." He says, "You have brought me very low." Even in the face of unspeakable tragedy, Jephthah is blame-shifting. His primary concern is not her life. It is his own lost status. He is completely paralyzed by his transactional theology. The law of Moses explicitly forbade child sacrifice, calling it an abomination to Yahweh, a true judge of Israel. Upon realizing his horrific mistake, would have repented, offered a substitutionary sacrifice, and thrown himself on the mercy of God. But Jephthah is a creature of the wilderness. He knows only contracts, leverage, and the cold arithmetic of pagan bargains. He lacks the theological imagination to believe that God might prefer a broken heart. The question is, why a man deeply empowered by the Spirit of God felt the desperate need to bribe God in the first place, over a murdered child. He believes he is legally trapped. His daughter, possessing more nobility than her father will ever know, accepts the consequence of his foolishness. She asks only for 2 months to wander the mountains and weep for her virginity, mourning the fact that she will never marry, never bear children, and that her father's line will end in the ashes. The text delivers the horrific conclusion with quiet, agonizing restraint. He did with her according to his vow that he had made. The victory is completely empty. The vow Jephthah made to guarantee his future in Israel has guaranteed that he will have no future at all. His desperate need to secure his own legacy has caused him to destroy it with his own hands. The door of his family line is slammed shut forever. But the bloodshed of his reign is not over. Jephthah is a traumatized man who only knows how to resolve conflict through violence. And while he sits in the ruin of his own house, the shadow of a massive army falls across the Jordan River. This time, the enemy is not from Ammon. The ashes of his daughter's tragic end have barely cooled when a new threat mobilizes. But this time, to understand the answer, we have to look at the doorway where his story begins. This is not ultimately a story about a rash promise. The enemy does not march from the pagan nations of the east. They cross the Jordan River from the west. They are the men of Ephraim, Jephthah's own Israelite brothers. Ephraim is a massive, proud, and dominant tribe. They are furious that Jephthah fought the Ammonites without inviting them to share in the glory and the spoils of war. Their grievance is arrogant, and their threat is brutal. They march into his territory, and deliver a terrifying ultimatum. Why did you cross over to fight against the Ammonites, and did not call us to go with you? We will burn your house over you with fire. Notice the cruel irony of their threat. They threatened to burn his house down. The very house that just produced the sacrifice of his only child. The house that is now an empty tomb of his own making. Decades earlier, another Israelite judge faced this exact same political crisis. After Gideon defeated the Midianites, the men of Ephraim marched on him with the exact same arrogant complaint. But Gideon used brilliant diplomacy. He flattered them. He praised their superior harvest and elevated their pride. He de-escalated the tension with words, and the civil war was entirely avoided. We already know Jephthah is capable of this kind of statesmanship. Before the Ammonite War, he constructed a masterpiece of historical diplomacy. It is a story about the devastating cost of treating God as a transactional partner. It is a portrait of a man whose entire identity was forged. He is a master negotiator. He could have appeased Ephraim. He could have chosen peace. But Jephthah is no longer the calculated diplomat. The tragedy has hollowed him out. He is a traumatized, broken warlord who has just paid the ultimate, horrifying price for his leadership. And now these entitled brothers dare to threaten the ruins of his home. His response is entirely devoid of grace. He does not use words to heal. He uses them to justify a bloodbath. He rallies the men of Gilead, strikes Ephraim, and takes control of the shallow crossings of the Jordan River to cut off their retreat. What follows is one of the darkest, most chilling scenes in all of biblical history. As the defeated Ephraimites try to flee back across the river, the Gileadite guards stop them. To identify the retreating soldiers who are trying to blend in, they use a linguistic test. The Gileadites demand that each man pronounce a single Hebrew word, shibboleth. The word itself simply means a flowing stream or an ear of grain. But the dialect of the Ephraimites did not include the sh sound. When an Ephraimite tried to speak the password, he could only say sibboleth. A single mispronounced syllable became a death sentence. The text records the horrifying arithmetic of the slaughter. 42,000 men of Ephraim fell at the river, in profound childhood rejection. In the wilderness of Tob, Jephthah does not simply disappear. He survives. The text tells us that worthless fellows collected around Jephthah, 42,000 Israelites slaughtered by their own brothers. Jephthah does not just defeat Ephraim, he massacres them. The man who was raised up by the Spirit to deliver Israel from its pagan enemies has become a butcher, executing his own people. Over a regional accent, the deterioration is absolute. The Savior of Gilead stands ankle-deep in the blood of his countrymen, completely consumed by the violence he once used to survive the wilderness. We are meant to look at this brutal, broken man, standing by a river of blood, and feel a deep sense of revulsion. But we are also meant to see something else. The rivers run with Israelite blood. And we are forced to look closely at the root of the tragedy. How does this shattered warlord, making fatal bargains and destroying his own family, reflect our own spiritual condition? The tragedy of Jephthah is easy to judge from a distance. We look at the ashes of his daughter and the 42,000 bodies, choking the Jordan River, and we instinctively recoil. It is comfortable to view him simply as a monster from a brutal, primitive era. But if we strip away the ancient setting and the violence, the core architecture of his failure is startlingly familiar. We are often much more like the warlord, and went out with him. He becomes a warlord. He gathers other outcasts, men who have also been rejected by polite society, of Gilead, than we want to admit. When you trace his story back to its root, you do not find a monster. You find an outcast standing at a closed door. You find a deeply insecure man whose identity was forged in rejection because human beings had only ever used him, betrayed him, or abandoned him. He assumed God would do the exact same thing. He believed his status in the world was incredibly fragile, and he tried to control his circumstances through negotiation. How often do your own prayers sound like a contract when the pressure mounts, when a terrifying medical diagnosis arrives? when a marriage is fracturing, or when your financial security vanishes. What is your first instinct? We may not offer literal burnt offerings, but we make our own vows in the dark. We try to manufacture leverage with the Almighty. Lord, if you heal them, I will never commit that sin again. If you provide this money, I will serve in the church every week. If you just get me out of this crisis, I will read my Bible every day for the rest of my life. Without realizing it, we are treating Yahweh exactly like a Canaanite deity. We believe his favor must be purchased. We project our own trauma, our past rejections, and our fear of abandonment onto the creator of the universe. On the other side stands a young man in the dust. He has just been stripped of his home, his legal rights, and his father's name, and he builds them into a lethal raiding militia, out in the desert sand, away from the respectable families of Gilead. We assume that he does not actually want to help us, so we offer our good behavior, our devotion, and our sacrifices as bribes to force his hand. This is not ultimately a story about a rash, ancient promise. It is a story about the devastating cost of a transactional faith. Jephthah's tragedy was not that God demanded a terrible price for the victory. His tragedy was that God did not want a price at all. Remember the precise chronological sequence of the text. The Spirit of the Lord came upon Jephthah before he ever opened his mouth to negotiate. God had already freely given him the power, the presence, and the guarantee of success. The divine endorsement was already a present reality, but Jephthah could not rest in a freely given grace. His profound insecurity demanded a contract. What are you trying to buy from God? That he has already freely offered? What are you trying to control through your religious performance? Transactional faith will always demand more than you can afford to pay. It will hollow out your spiritual life, leaving you exhausted, bitter, and constantly wondering if you have done enough to keep God from closing the door on you. If a transactional faith destroys us, what is the alternative? How do we escape the endless cycle of trying to earn our place? The answer lies in looking at how Jephthah's tragic reign finally ends, and the one who eventually takes his place. Jephthah learns that the only way to secure your place in the world is through leverage and violence. If you want something, you take it. The tragic irony of Jephthah's life is cemented in the brutal brevity of his reign. After the astonishing victory over the Ammonites, after the devastating sacrifice of his only daughter, and after the horrifying massacre of 42,000 Israelites at the Jordan River, Jephthah rules for only 6 years. It is one of the shortest tenures of any major biblical judge. When he dies, there is no grand memorial. The text simply records that he was buried in the cities of Gilead. He leaves behind no heir to carry his name. He establishes no royal dynasty. He brings no lasting peace to the land. The outcast fought his entire life to secure a permanent place, but he goes to his grave entirely alone. He won the war, but he lost everything that made the victory matter. Jephthah was a brilliant tactician and a master negotiator, but he was ultimately destroyed by his inability to trust. He could never accept that the Spirit of Yahweh was a freely given gift. He believed that love, security, and divine favor always had to be purchased through a desperate bargain. But the biblical narrative does not leave us in the ashes of this transactional faith. Centuries later, another rejected son emerges from the wilderness to deliver his people from an enemy far greater than Ammon. If you need security, you negotiate an ironclad contract. He learns to trust no one. He learns that every relationship is a transaction. Like Jephthah, Jesus of Nazareth is despised by the religious elite. He is cast out by his own brothers. He is led outside the gates of the very city he came to save. But the contrast between the tragic warlord of Gilead and the true king of Israel is absolute. Jesus does not view the Father as a reluctant deity who must be bribed. He does not negotiate for our deliverance by demanding a terrible price from someone else. When the true judge of Israel steps onto the battlefield of sin and death, he does not offer up the life of his child to secure the victory. He offers himself. He becomes the sacrifice. Look back at the physical doorway where this entire tragedy began. A young man stands in the dust, watching the heavy wooden door of his father's house slam shut. He is stripped of his inheritance, separated from his family, and condemned to the wilderness. That single moment of profound rejection forged a man who believed he had to fight, manipulate, and bargain for every scrap of security in his life. But because of Christ, you do not have to live like the outcast. In the wilderness of Tob, you do not have to frantically negotiate with the Almighty, offering up your own desperate vows in the dark. For years, he perfects his military skill in the shadows. He builds a reputation so fierce that his name is whispered back in the hometown, to guarantee his love. The victory over your greatest enemy has already been won. The Spirit has already been freely given. The inheritance you could never earn has been securely established. The transactional faith of the ancient world is dead. The true Son has secured your place, not through a calculated legal bargain, but through the overwhelming power of unmerited grace. The door to the Father's house is no longer closed. It is being held wide open. You only have to drop your bargains, step out of the dust, and walk inside. If this journey through the tragic life of Jephthah helped you see the grace of Scripture in a new light, please consider subscribing and sharing this study with someone who needs it. Leave a comment below, and join us next time as we uncover another hidden pattern in the text that expelled him. The outcast at the closed door has become a weapon, and he is entirely content to stay in the wilderness. But the political landscape is shifting. A massive Ammonite army is gathering on the borders of Israel, preparing to slaughter the very men who drove Jephthah away. The elders of Gilead suddenly realize their legitimate sons do not know how to fight. They need a monster to defeat a monster. The outcast has built his life in exile. But a regional crisis is about to force a desperate reunion. The Ammonite army marches into Gilead and sets up camp. The text tells us the leaders of Israel are terrified. They have wealth, they have land, and they have legitimate families. But they do not have a general. His brothers have driven him out, and the elders of his city have watched it happen without saying a word. In a moment of sheer panic, the elders make a humiliating decision. They leave their comfortable estates, travel out of the fertile hills, and cross into the harsh, sun-baked wilderness of Tob to find the boy they threw away. Imagine the scene: wealthy, respectable men standing in the dust, surrounded by Jephthah's hardened militia. When they finally speak, the power dynamic has completely inverted. They do not command him, they beg him, "Come and be our leader, that we may fight against the Ammonites." A lesser man, desperate for the approval of his former abusers, might have immediately accepted. But Jephthah is a survivor. He understands the mechanics of leverage, and he knows exactly how these men operate. He looks at the elders, the very men who watched silently as his brothers stripped him of his inheritance, and he exposes their hypocrisy. "Did you not hate me and drive me out of my father's house? Why have you come to me now when you are in distress?" He knows they do not want him. They want his violence. They want his outcasts. And he knows that the moment the Ammonite threat is eliminated, the respectable men of Gilead will close the door on the son of the prostitute all over again. So Jephthah refuses to be used. The young man's name is Jephthah. His mother was a prostitute. And in the ancient tribal world of Gilead, that makes him a liability to the family estate. He demands a transaction. The elders initially offer him the position of military commander, a temporary role for a time of crisis. Jephthah counters their offer. He tells them that if Yahweh gives him the victory, he will not just be their commander. He demands to become their permanent head. The Hebrew text is precise. The elders offer him the title of Qatzin, a wartime captain. Jephthah demands the title of Rosh, the absolute political and judicial ruler over all the inhabitants of Gilead. He is negotiating for the very thing they stole from him years ago, an undisputed, permanent place in his homeland, with an enemy army at their throats. The elders have no choice. They agree to his terms, but Jephthah still does not trust them. He forces them to formalize the treaty in the presence of Yahweh at the sacred site of Mizpah. He binds them in a legal, theological contract, so they can never retract their promise. This moment is critical for understanding the tragedy that is about to unfold. It reveals the core architecture of Jephthah's heart. He believes that human relationships are inherently unstable. He believes that love, acceptance, and security are never freely given. In his world, status must be seized through leverage. So the door is closed. He is cast out into the wilderness of Tob, a barren region on the edge of the Syrian desert, guaranteed by contract, and backed by the threat of force. He does not trust people. He trusts binding agreements. He has spent his entire life learning how to protect himself through careful negotiation. In a single conversation, he has secured his political power. He has forced the men who hated him to bow before him. He has won the internal war for Gilead without drawing a sword. But political maneuvering cannot stop an invading king. The Ammonite army is still camped on the border, waiting for blood. Having forced the elders of his own city into a corner, the new ruler of Gilead turns his calculating mind toward the enemy. Most readers expect a desert warlord to answer a threat with immediate violence. After all, Jephthah was hired by the elders of Gilead for one specific purpose: to shed Ammonite blood. But as the newly appointed head of the region, his first move is surprisingly restrained. He does not sound the trumpets for battle. Instead, he sends diplomats. He contacts the king of the Ammonites with a simple, confrontational question: "What do you have against me, that you have come to me to fight against my land?" The Ammonite king responds with a historical grievance. He claims that centuries earlier, when Israel came up from Egypt, they stole Ammonite territory. His demand is straightforward: return the land peacefully, or face total annihilation. Most readers know Jephthah's name. He is remembered as one of the most tragic figures in the Old Testament. What happens next shatters the assumption that Jephthah is merely an uneducated brute from the wilderness. He dictates a response to the enemy king that is a masterpiece of ancient diplomacy. Standing in the camp, the former outcast recounts more than 300 years of Israelite history with breathtaking precision. He reminds the king that Israel did not attack Ammon or Moab during the Exodus. He meticulously recounts how Moses asked for peaceful passage, how Israel was denied, and how they deliberately bypassed Ammonite territory to avoid conflict. He details the exact geographical borders of the Arnon and the Jabbok rivers. He reminds the Ammonite king that it was Sihon, the Amorite ruler, who originally attacked Israel, and that Yahweh gave Sihon's land to Israel as the rightful victor in a defensive war. Jephthah is building a meticulous courtroom defense. He argues from historical precedent, international borders, and theological reality. He even uses the enemy's own religion against them, presenting a devastatingly logical argument. Will you not possess what Chemosh, your God, gives you to possess? And all that Yahweh our God has dispossessed before us, we will possess. He is attempting to win a war through a legal brief. He is doing exactly what he did with the elders of Gilead just days before, using his intellect to negotiate a binding agreement. Jephthah's worldview is built on the belief that if you can just present a perfect legal case, you can control the outcome. He is the judge who made a catastrophic vow, promising to sacrifice whatever came out of his house if God gave him victory in battle. He concludes his message by formally placing the dispute in the hands of the ultimate arbitrator. Let Yahweh, the judge, decide this day between the people of Israel and the people of Ammon. It is a brilliant, airtight argument, but the biblical text delivers a chilling, one-sentence resolution to his diplomatic masterpiece. But the king of the Ammonites did not listen to the words of Jephthah that he sent to him. The king ignores the message. The negotiation fails. The legal avenue is completely closed. For a man who has survived his entire life by manipulating contracts and brokering deals, this is a terrifying realization. His words carry no weight here. Logic has failed. Diplomacy is dead. There is no leverage left to exploit. And the massive Ammonite army prepares to march. Jephthah is forced to face the one thing he cannot control with a negotiation. Violence is now inevitable. The warlord must finally go to war. But just as human words are exhausted, The text reveals that Jephthah is not walking into this battle alone. The silence does not last. Diplomacy has collapsed. The king of Ammon is deaf to reason, and the legal avenue is entirely closed. The dust rises as the marching orders are given, and Jephthah prepares to meet a massive enemy army on the battlefield. The common interpretation is that Jephthah was a faithful, zealous leader who made a foolish but binding mistake. But right at this critical threshold, the biblical text inserts a detail that ought to change how we read everything that follows. It is a single sentence in Judges chapter 11, verse 19. And it alters the entire theological architecture of the story. Then the Spirit of the Lord was upon Jephthah. Do not rush past those words. In the brutal, chaotic book of Judges, the arrival of the Spirit of Yahweh is the ultimate guarantee of victory. It happened with Othniel. It happened with Gideon. It is God's visible, empowering presence, arriving to secure the deliverance of his people. Jephthah is no longer just a desert warlord leading a band of outcasts. He is now the freshly anointed, divinely appointed judge of Israel. The text tells us the Spirit drives him forward. He passes swiftly through Gilead and Manasseh, rallying his troops, crossing over the rugged landscape to confront the Ammonites head-on. He has the army. He has the political backing of the elders. And most importantly, he has the Spirit of the living God. The victory is already assured. God has freely given him the exact divine backing he needs to secure his homeland. All Jephthah has to do is march forward and trust the God who has already equipped him. But he stops. We are often taught that he was a man trapped by his own devotion, forced to destroy his only daughter. And in the very next verse, the tragedy begins. The text reads, "And Jephthah made a vow to the Lord and said, 'If you will give the Ammonites into my hand,'" read that chronological sequence carefully. If you will give them into my hand, God had already placed his Spirit upon him. The divine endorsement was already a present reality. But Jephthah cannot accept it. This is where the profound psychological damage of his childhood rejection takes control of his theology. Jephthah is a man who has never been given anything for free. His brothers stripped him of his inheritance. The elders of his city only accepted him when he forced them into a binding legal contract. Throughout his entire life, love, status, and security have always cost something. Every alliance he has ever known has been bought and paid for. In his harsh wilderness, a freely given gift does not exist. Now, he projects that exact same broken framework onto Yahweh. He cannot fathom a God who freely gives power to a rejected outcast. He assumes the God of Israel operates just like the elders of Gilead, untrustworthy unless bound by a legal oath. In Jephthah's mind, the presence of the Spirit is not a guarantee. It is merely an opening bid. To ensure his permanent status, he believes he must offer God a contract. He must bribe the Almighty.